The rain hammered against the bulletproof windows of the black SUV as Damian Cross stared at the figure huddled beneath the restaurant awning, something about her posture triggering recognition he couldn't yet name. His driver had already passed the entrance when Damian's hand shot out, gripping the headrest with enough force to leave impressions in the leather. The vehicle stopped so abruptly that the security detail in the car behind nearly collided with them, radios crackling with confused questions. Damian ignored the voices, his entire focus locked on the woman kneeling on the wet pavement, her cardboard sign dissolving in the downpour. She wore a coat 3 sizes too large, the fabric hanging from shoulders that seemed too fragile to support even that meager weight. Her hair, once golden and lustrous, now hung in dull tangles around a face he'd memorized in another lifetime. The coffee cup in her trembling hands was the detail that destroyed him, white styrofoam gripped like a lifeline, steam rising into the cold air. She wasn't drinking from it, just holding it against her palms, seeking whatever warmth the cheap gas station coffee could provide. Her eyes stayed fixed on the ground, avoiding the gazes of well-dressed patrons entering the establishment behind her. Damian was out of the vehicle before his security chief could protest, rain soaking through his $1,000 suit within seconds. His shoes splashed through puddles as he crossed the sidewalk, each step feeling like wading through concrete. The woman didn't look up until his shadow fell across her, blocking the amber glow from the restaurant windows. Recognition dawned in her eyes the moment before terror replaced it. Raw, visceral fear that transformed her features into a mask of desperation. Cecilia dropped the coffee cup, the liquid spreading across the pavement in a dark bloom as she scrambled backward. Her movements were those of a cornered animal, hands scraping against brick as she tried to stand on legs that wouldn't support her weight. "Stay away from me," she whispered, the words barely audible over the rain's percussion. Her voice was hoarse, damaged by exposure or screaming or both. She raised one hand as if that fragile barrier could hold back the man who'd once commanded armies of soldiers with a single gesture. Damian froze, his hands rising slowly in a gesture of surrender that felt foreign to muscles accustomed to authority. He'd faced down rival families, survived assassination attempts, negotiated treaties worth millions, but nothing had prepared him for the look in Cecilia's eyes. She wasn't looking at her former husband. She was looking at something monstrous, something that haunted her waking moments. Cecilia. Her name emerged rough, catching on 3 years of unanswered questions. "What happened to you?" The inadequacy of the words struck him immediately, but language seemed insufficient for the chasm between them. She shook her head violently, matted hair whipping across her hollow cheeks. Her breathing came in rapid gasps, the onset of panic tightening her chest visibly beneath the oversized coat. The restaurant door opened behind them, laughter and warmth spilling onto the street, and Cecilia flinched as if struck. "Please," she managed, her legs finally giving out completely. She slid down the wall, knees hitting the pavement with force that must have hurt. "Please don't hurt him. I did everything you wanted. I stayed away. I didn't tell anyone." The words made no sense, each one a puzzle piece from a picture Damian couldn't see. He took one careful step closer, crouching to bring himself to her eye level. Rain ran down his face, into his collar, but he barely noticed the cold seeping into his bones. Hurt who? His mind was already racing through possibilities, each more devastating than the last. "Cecilia, I don't understand." "Who told you to stay away?" Her eyes rolled back, consciousness slipping away as malnutrition and exhaustion claimed what fear had begun. Damian lunged forward, catching her before her head struck the concrete, shocked by how little she weighed in his arms. She felt like paper and brittle bones, nothing like the woman who'd once danced in their kitchen at midnight. His security chief appeared at his shoulder, already calling for the private physician on speed dial. Other guards formed a perimeter, redirecting curious onlookers with practiced efficiency. The restaurant manager stood in the doorway, phone raised, and Damian fixed him with a look that had made grown men confess their sins. "Delete that footage," he said quietly, the words somehow cutting through the rain's noise. "All of it, from every camera on this block. Now." He lifted Cecilia fully into his arms, her head lolling against his chest as he turned back toward the SUV. The cardboard sign lay abandoned on the pavement, its message running in inked rivers. "Anything helps. God bless." The sight of it ignited something volcanic in his chest, a rage so complete it threatened to consume rational thought. Someone had reduced his Cecilia to this. Someone had taken the artist who painted murals of hope and joy and left her begging in the rain. The security detail parted as he approached, their faces carefully neutral despite the questions burning in their eyes. Damien had built his reputation on control, on calculated responses to every crisis. But carrying his ex-wife's unconscious form through the rain, feeling her ribs press against his arms through the wet fabric, control felt like a luxury he could no longer afford. 3 years ago, Cecilia had vanished from their home without explanation, taking nothing but essentials and leaving their son crying in his nursery. Damien had searched, spent fortunes on investigators, pulled every string in his considerable web of influence. The penthouse elevator required a fingerprint scan and a 16-digit code that changed hourly, security measures that now felt obscene given what Cecilia had endured. Damien held her against his chest as the lift climbed 60 floors, watching her face in the mirrored walls. Even unconscious, tension lined her features, small tremors running through her frame at irregular intervals. Dr. Parrish was waiting when the doors opened, his medical bag already unpacked on the dining table Damien never used. The physician had served the Cross family for 2 decades, asking no questions about bullet wounds or sudden disappearances. His expression remained professionally neutral as Damien carried Cecilia toward the master bedroom, though his eyes betrayed shock at her condition. "Set her on the bed," Parrish instructed, pulling out a stethoscope and blood pressure cuff. "How long has she been on the street?" Damien realized he didn't know, the absence of knowledge like ground glass in his throat. He laid Cecilia down with a gentleness that contradicted his reputation, arranging pillows beneath her head with hands that had signed death warrants. The silk sheets looked obscene against her filthy clothes, the contrast between luxury and destitution almost physically painful to witness. Parrish worked efficiently, checking vital signs and starting an IV line with practiced ease. He cut away the oversized coat, revealing layers beneath, 2 more jackets, 3 shirts, all salvaged from donations or dumpsters. Each layer told a story of survival, of cold nights, and desperate measures. "Severe malnutrition," Parrish murmured, his fingers checking for broken bones with clinical precision. "Dehydration, possible pneumonia, infected lacerations on both feet. When did you last see her?" 3 years ago. The words tasted like ash. Damien moved to the windows, staring out at the city lights below. Somewhere in that urban sprawl, Cecilia had been struggling to survive while he'd lived in temperature-controlled comfort. Parrish's silence spoke volumes as he continued his examination, documenting injuries with the thoroughness of someone who understood these records might matter later. He cleaned wounds, administered antibiotics, adjusted the IV drip with efficient movements. The bedroom smelled of antiseptic and rain, a combination that made Damien's stomach turn. "She needs hospitalization," Parrish finally said, packing away his instruments. "Proper treatment, monitoring. This level of malnutrition requires careful refeeding to avoid complications. No hospitals." Damien's response was immediate, absolute. No records, no questions. "You treat her here. Bring whatever equipment you need. Bill whatever you want." Parrish studied him for a long moment before nodding, recognizing the futility of argument. He'd seen enough of Damien's world to understand that hospitals meant exposure, vulnerability, questions that couldn't be answered safely. He left instructions for round-the-clock care, promising to return in 6 hours. Damien dismissed his security detail, wanting privacy for what came next. He pulled a chair beside the bed, studying Cecilia's face in the lamplight. Someone had done this to her, reduced her to shadows and fear. The rage he'd felt on the street had crystallized into something colder, more dangerous. Her eyes opened near midnight, unfocused at first before sharpening with recognition and renewed terror. She tried to sit up, yanking at the IV line hard enough to tear the tape securing it. Damien raised his hands again, that same gesture of surrender. "You're safe," he said quietly, though the words felt presumptuous. "You're in my penthouse. Dr. Parrish treated you. Nobody knows you're here." Cecilia's breathing accelerated, her gaze darting around the familiar bedroom they'd once shared. She located the exits with practiced efficiency. The door, the windows, the bathroom. Her hands gripped the sheets, preparing to flee despite her body's obvious weakness. "You drugged me." The accusation emerged flat, factual. "You brought me here to—" She couldn't finish, tears streaming down her gaunt cheeks. "To what?" Damien leaned forward, desperate to understand the narrative playing in her mind. "Cecilia, I found you begging in the rain. You collapsed. What did you think I would do?" "What they said you'd do." Her voice broke on the words. "If I came back, if I tried to see him, they said you'd make sure I disappeared permanently." The pronoun registered like a gunshot. Damien's blood turned to ice, his mind racing through implications. See who? Who told you this? Cecilia's expression shifted to confusion, as if the answer should be obvious. Her lips trembled as she spoke the word that changed everything. Felix. The name of their son hung between them like a detonation, scattering Damien's thoughts into fragments he couldn't reassemble. Felix, who'd been 2 years old when Cecilia vanished, who was now 5, and asked questions about his mother that Damien couldn't answer. The boy who'd stopped crying for her after 6 months, who'd learned to accept her absence as permanent. You think I threatened our son? Damien's voice came out strangled, disbelieving. You think I would hurt Felix to control you? Cecilia's eyes blazed with something beyond fear, a fury born from 3 years of protective terror. She struggled to sit up despite the IV, despite her body's protests, meeting his gaze with defiance that seemed to drain her remaining strength. I know what you're capable of, Damien. I always knew, but I thought our family was sacred. The accusation struck deeper than any blade, opening wounds Damien hadn't known existed. He'd built his empire on violence when necessary, on calculated ruthlessness that kept rival families at bay. But the idea that Cecilia believed him capable of weaponizing their child felt like a fundamental misunderstanding of everything he was. Tell me exactly what happened, he demanded, forcing his voice into something approaching calm. Every detail, from the beginning. Who contacted you? How? Cecilia's hands shook as she pushed hair from her face, the simple movement revealing how much the effort cost her. She closed her eyes, and Damien watched her gather courage like someone preparing to touch fire. When she spoke again, her voice carried the mechanical quality of testimony rehearsed through countless sleepless nights. It started with photographs, she whispered. Delivered to my studio in unmarked envelopes. Felix at the playground, climbing the red slide he loved. Felix outside his preschool, holding hands with Mrs. Chen during dismissal. Felix through his bedroom window, sleeping with that stuffed elephant. Each image she described was a violation, a demonstration of access that made Damien's blood run cold. Someone had surveilled their son with predatory precision, documenting his routines with enough detail to prove they could reach him any time. The implied threat needed no elaboration. The first letter said, I was making you weak, Cecilia continued, her eyes still closed as if unable to face the memories directly. That your enemies saw you as vulnerable because of us. That Felix would pay the price for your softness unless I removed the liability. Damien's hands curled into fists, nails biting into his palms hard enough to draw blood. The language was familiar, the rhetoric of old-school families who viewed love as weakness, who sacrificed everything human for power's sake. But which of his enemies had access to such intimate surveillance? They gave me 72 hours to leave, Cecilia said, opening her eyes to stare at the ceiling. 72 hours to disappear completely, to never contact you or Felix again. If I went to the police, Felix would die. If I told you, Felix would die. If I tried to take him with me, he'd die and they'd make me watch. The clinical precision of the threats spoke to professional work, someone who understood psychological warfare. Damien's mind cataloged possibilities, running through associates and enemies with the resources and motivation for such an operation. The list was disturbingly long. I left everything, Cecilia whispered. My phone, my credit cards, anything they could trace. I took cash from the emergency fund in the studio and just walked away. I watched from across the street as you came home that night, watched you realize I was gone. Damien remembered that evening with crystalline clarity, arriving to find Felix inconsolable, Mrs. Chen apologetic and confused, Cecilia's absence like a hole torn in reality. He'd assumed an affair, a crisis of identity, anything but this calculated terrorism. The truth felt worse than any betrayal he'd imagined. I slept in shelters at first, she continued, her voice growing more distant. Changed locations constantly, never stayed anywhere long enough to establish patterns. I cut my hair, wore donated clothes, made myself invisible. Every day I waited for news that something happened to Felix, that I'd failed to protect him. The image of Cecilia, his Cecilia who'd decorated their home with her paintings, who'd sung Felix to sleep with songs she invented. Sleeping among strangers in institutional beds made Damien's chest constrict. She'd chosen homelessness over risking their son's safety, endured 3 years of degradation because someone convinced her the threat was real. I saw you sometimes, Cecilia admitted, her gaze finally meeting his. On the street, getting into your car. You looked right through me twice, didn't recognize me. I was grateful for that. Thought it meant I'd changed enough to stay hidden. Damien thought of the times he'd distributed money to homeless populations near his operations, a habit born from Cecilia's influence when they'd been together. The possibility that he'd given charity to his own wife without recognition felt like cosmic cruelty, a punishment for blindness he couldn't have prevented. "Why come back to this neighborhood?" he asked, the question tactical even through emotional devastation. Why risk being seen if you believed the threat was real? Cecilia's expression crumbled, tears flowing freely down her wasted cheeks. Her hands twisted in the expensive sheets, creating wrinkles in fabric that cost more than she'd probably seen in months. "Because I'm dying, Damien. Because I needed to see him one more time, even from a distance, before I don't get the chance." The words hit like physical blows, each syllable a small death. Damien lunged forward, grabbing her shoulders with a desperation that bordered on violence. "What do you mean dying?" Parrish said malnutrition, infections, things we can treat. "My heart," she whispered, placing a skeletal hand over her chest. "The stress, the malnutrition, the exposure. A free clinic doctor told me 3 months ago. Without proper treatment, without rest and medication I can't afford. I have maybe 6 months. I'd made peace with it. Thought at least Felix would be safe, even if I wasn't there to see him grow up." Damien pulled out his phone before Cecilia could protest, his fingers moving with violent precision across the screen. He sent encrypted messages to his most trusted medical contacts, demanding specialists, equipment, whatever it took to reverse damage that should never have occurred. The idea of her dying, of losing her permanently when he just found her, was incomprehensible, unacceptable. "You're not dying," he stated with the same certainty he used to close impossible deals. "Parrish will coordinate with cardiologists tonight. We'll have specialists here by morning with whatever technology exists to fix this." Cecilia watched him with something between hope and resignation, as if she'd learned not to trust and rescue. She pulled the blanket higher despite the room's perfect temperature, a defensive gesture that spoke to months of inadequate shelter. Her next words emerged barely audible, weighted with a question that had clearly haunted her. "Is he okay, Felix? Does he ask about me? Does he hate me for leaving?" The raw vulnerability in her voice demolished what remained of Damien's composure. He sat on the bed's edge, maintaining careful distance despite the urge to gather her close. He stopped asking after the first year. "Mrs. Chen tried to keep your memory alive, but I didn't know what to tell him that wouldn't be a lie." Cecilia's sob was soundless, her body curling inward as if to contain grief too large for physical form. Damien watched her shoulders shake, feeling more helpless than he'd ever felt facing armed rivals. 3 years of separation from their son, endured to protect him from a threat that might have been fabricated. "He needs to see you," Damien said carefully, already calculating logistics. "Tomorrow, when you're stronger. He deserves to know his mother is alive." Terror flashed across Cecilia's features, her hand shooting out to grab his wrist with surprising strength. "No, you can't tell him about me. If whoever sent those letters finds out I'm back, if they think I've broken the agreement, they're not going to touch Felix." Damien's voice dropped to the register his associates called the executioner's tone. Quiet, absolute, promising consequences beyond imagination. "I will burn this entire city to ash before anyone harms our son. You have my word on that." Cecilia studied his face as if searching for deception, her artist's eyes cataloging micro-expressions most people missed. Whatever she found there must have satisfied some criteria because she slowly released his wrist, though doubt still shadowed her features. "You don't understand how thorough they were. They knew things only someone close to you could know." The implication crystallized in Damien's mind like ice forming on glass. An inside threat, someone within his organization with access to family details most soldiers never saw. The realization narrowed the suspect pool considerably, transformed this from external attack to internal betrayal. His thoughts immediately went to his inner circle, the handful of people trusted with Felix's security arrangements. "Tomorrow I want you to tell me everything you remember about those letters," he said, his mind already constructing investigative frameworks. Every word, every detail about the envelopes, the photographs, handwriting, printing style, paper quality, anything distinctive. Cecilia nodded slowly, exhaustion pulling at her features despite the IV fluids. Her eyelids drooped, fighting against consciousness with visible effort. "I kept one," she whispered, "hidden in the lining of this coat. I don't know why. Maybe I thought if something happened to me, someone would find it and understand." Damien's pulse accelerated as she gestured weakly toward the pile of discarded clothing on the floor. He retrieved the oversized coat, examining the lining until his fingers found the irregularity, a small tear concealing folded paper. He extracted it with the care usually reserved for detonation devices, unfolding yellowed pages covered in laser-printed text. The message was brief, clinical in its cruelty. Your presence makes him vulnerable. Enemies circle, waiting for opportunities your existence provides. Remove yourself permanently, or watch him suffer consequences of your selfishness. You have 72 hours. Proof of compliance required. Below the text was a phone number, presumably for confirming her departure. What made Damien's blood turn arctic was the signature at the bottom. Not a name, but a symbol he recognized immediately. The Cross family crest, slightly modified, used only by ranking members of his inner circle. Someone had weaponized his own organization's iconography to terrorize his wife into exile. He photographed the letter with his phone, already composing messages to his security chief. Every person with access to that crest would be investigated, their movements during the relevant timeline scrutinized, their communications analyzed for evidence. The betrayer was close, trusted, someone who'd sat at his table and smiled while orchestrating this nightmare. Sleep now, he told Cecilia, folding the letter carefully into his jacket. I'll be in the next room. You're safe here. She was already drifting, medications and exhaustion pulling her under. Damien watched her breathing even out, counting each rise and fall of her chest, as if to reassure himself she was real, alive, recoverable. 3 years she'd endured hell because someone convinced her he was the threat. He stepped into his office, closing the door before allowing rageful expression. A crystal tumbler shattered against the wall, expensive whiskey bleeding down imported wallpaper. Someone in his organization had declared private war on his family, had weaponized his reputation and resources against the people he loved most. The desk phone's secure line connected him to his security chief within 2 rings. Assemble the council, Damien ordered. Everyone who has access to family security protocols. I want them in the conference room by dawn. There would be no sleep tonight. No rest until he'd identified the cancer growing in his organization. Damien pulled surveillance footage from 3 years ago, beginning the frame-by-frame analysis of who'd been where when Cecilia disappeared. The work was meticulous, mind-numbing, but somewhere in these digital archives was evidence of treachery. Dawn broke over the city in shades of amber and steel as Damien's security council assembled in the fortified conference room. 7 men who'd served the Cross family for decades sat around Brazilian walnut, their faces reflecting various degrees of confusion about the emergency summons. Warren Finch occupied his usual position at Damien's right hand, the consigliere's silver hair impeccably groomed despite the early hour. Damien studied each face with predatory focus, searching for tells that might reveal guilt or knowledge. He'd played poker with these men for years, knew their tics and patterns, understood how they processed stress. This morning they would all be tested in ways they couldn't anticipate. 3 years ago, my wife disappeared, Damien began without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated fury. I was led to believe she'd abandoned our family voluntarily. That belief was orchestrated by someone in this room. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the building's ventilation system. Warren leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting from confusion to calculated interest. The other council members exchanged glances, their surprise appearing genuine. But Damien had learned early that genuine reactions could be manufactured by professionals. He placed copies of the threatening letter in front of each man, watching their eyes move across the familiar crest. Someone used our organization's symbols to terrorize Cecilia into exile. Someone with detailed knowledge of Felix's routines, his security arrangements, his daily life. Someone at this table. Warren picked up his copy, reading with the careful attention he brought to all documents. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that could indicate either outrage or recognition. This is unconscionable, he said quietly. Using a child as leverage violates every code we operate under. It does, Damien agreed, his gaze never leaving Warren's face. Which is why the guilty party clearly believed they were acting in the organization's best interests. Someone who saw my family as vulnerability rather than strength. The accusation hung unspoken but clear. Damien watched Warren's pupils dilate slightly, the physiological response to stress or adrenaline that couldn't be consciously controlled. The consigliere's hands remained steady on the table, but a muscle jumped in his jaw, microscopic evidence of tension he was trying to suppress. I found Cecilia last night, Damien continued, pulling out his phone to display photographs of her condition on the street. Starving, sick, homeless for 3 years because she believed protecting our son required her complete disappearance. This is what someone at this table reduced her to. The images circulated around the room, eliciting visible reactions of shock and disgust from most council members. Warren's face remained carefully neutral, but his breathing had changed. Shallower, more controlled, the respiration of someone managing internal crisis. He set down the photographs with deliberate care, fingers not quite steady. We need to investigate everyone who had access to Felix's security details during that time frame, Warren said, his professional mask firmly in place. Cross-reference communications, financial records, travel patterns. Someone this meticulous would have left traces. Damien nodded slowly, acknowledging the logic while noting Warren's eagerness to direct the investigation's methodology. Already underway. I've pulled 3 years of surveillance footage, phone records, financial transactions. My external security consultants are analyzing everything as we speak. The mention of external consultants made Warren's eyes flicker. A brief break in composure quickly suppressed. Damien filed the reaction away, another piece of circumstantial evidence accumulating into a damning portrait. The consigliere had always preferred keeping investigations internal, maintaining control over information flow. In the meantime, Damien said, standing to signal the meeting's conclusion, all of you are confined to the building. No external communications without my explicit approval. Security will escort you to guest quarters where you'll remain until this matter is resolved. The order transformed confusion into alarm. Several council members protested, citing business obligations and family commitments, but Damien's raised hand silenced them all. Someone here terrorized my wife and child. Until I know who, you're all suspects. Cooperate fully or face consequences that make exile look merciful. Warren remained seated as the others filed out under security escort, his expression thoughtful rather than panicked. You suspect me specifically, he stated when they were alone. You're using the council as theater, but you've already decided I'm responsible. Should I suspect you? Damien countered, returning to his seat. Give me one reason why you'd be above suspicion, when you've had unrestricted access to every aspect of my family's life. The consigliere's smile was slight, almost admiring. Because if I wanted to eliminate a threat to this organization, I would have done it permanently. Making Cecilia homeless accomplishes nothing strategically. It's emotional, personal, the work of someone who wanted her to suffer rather than simply disappear. The logic was sound, disturbingly so, which meant either Warren was innocent or sophisticated enough to construct plausible deniability. Damien leaned back, studying the man who'd advised him through countless crises. Then help me understand who would have that kind of personal investment in destroying her. Warren was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming a subtle pattern on the polished wood. 3 years ago, you were consolidating power after your father's death. Several factions within the organization questioned your leadership, saw you as too young, too influenced by civilian concerns. Your marriage to Cecilia was cited as evidence of weakness. Names, Damien demanded, though he already knew the factions Warren referenced. Internal politics had been brutal during that transition period, old guard resisting his reforms and modern approaches. The Castellano faction was most vocal, Warren said carefully, but they were eliminated in the consolidation. The Marino group had concerns but ultimately fell in line. There were individuals scattered throughout who grumbled about your domestic priorities, but no one with both motive and access to execute something this elaborate. Damien processed the information, cross-referencing it against what he knew of internal dynamics during Cecilia's disappearance. The timing aligned with his most vulnerable period as leader, when challenges to his authority had been frequent and occasionally violent. Someone could have viewed removing Cecilia as strategic advantage, weakening him emotionally, while demonstrating his inability to protect his own family. I want detailed files on everyone who questioned my leadership during that period, he ordered. Every conversation, every meeting, every communication that referenced Cecilia or Felix. Someone left breadcrumbs, and I will follow them to their source. Warren nodded, standing to leave. At the door he paused, his back to Damien. For what it's worth, I hope you find them quickly. What was done to Cecilia violates everything this family should stand for. We protect our own, always. Felix's routine hadn't changed in 3 years. Breakfast at 7:30, lessons with his tutor until noon. Supervised play in the penthouse's secured garden afterward. Damien watched from the kitchen doorway as his son constructed elaborate block towers, narrating stories about dragons and knights with the unself-conscious creativity of childhood. The boy had Cecilia's eyes, the same jade green that had stopped Damien's heart when they'd first met. Mrs. Chen supervised from a nearby bench, her weathered hands folding origami creatures Felix had requested. The elderly woman had been with their family since Felix's birth, her loyalty unquestionable, even during Cecilia's mysterious departure. She looked up as Damien approached, concern creasing her features at whatever she read in his expression. "We need to prepare Felix for something," Damien said quietly, crouching beside his son's construction project. "Something that's going to change everything he understands about our family." Felix looked up from his blocks, tilting his head with curiosity that mirrored Cecilia's habitual gesture. "Are we getting a puppy? Jamie from tutoring has a puppy and it's really soft." The innocent question fractured something in Damien's chest, reminding him how much childhood normalcy Felix had missed. "Better than a puppy," he said, choosing words carefully. "Someone very important is here. Someone who loves you very much but had to be away for a long time." Mrs. Chen's intake of breath was sharp, her origami crane crumpling in suddenly clenched fingers. Her eyes found Damien's, questions and hope warring in their depths. "Cecilia?" she whispered, the name emerging like a prayer. Damien nodded, keeping his focus on Felix's face as understanding slowly dawned. The boy's expression cycled through confusion, hope, and something that looked like fear, as if allowing himself to believe might invite disappointment too crushing to survive. "Mommy's here?" Felix's voice was small, uncertain. "Real mommy? Not the pictures?" The distinction gutted Damien, revealing how abstract the concept of mother had become for a child who'd lost her before memory could fully solidify. "Real mommy," he confirmed. "But Felix, you need to understand something important. She's been very sick, and she looks different than in the pictures. She's going to need time to get better." Felix processed this with the serious consideration he brought to complex problems, his small face scrunching in concentration. "Like when I had the flu and couldn't play for a week." "Something like that," Damien said, though the comparison felt inadequate. "She might be scared at first, might need us to be patient while she remembers how to be home again. Mrs. Chen moved closer, her hand finding Felix's shoulder with the protective instinct she'd always shown. "Your mother never stopped loving you," she said firmly. "Whatever kept her away, it wasn't because she didn't want to be here. You must believe that." Felix nodded slowly, sliding off his chair with the careful movements of someone approaching something precious and fragile. "Can I see her now? I've been practicing my reading like she wanted. I can read almost everything in my storybooks." Damien's throat tightened at the image of Felix preserving his mother's last instructions through 3 years of absence. He stood, offering his hand to his son. "Come on, but remember, go slowly, let her come to you. She might need time to remember how much she's missed you." They walked through the penthouse together, Felix's small hand gripping Damien's with enough force to betray his nervous excitement. Mrs. Chen followed at a respectful distance, tissues already clutched in anticipation of tears. The master bedroom door stood partially open, morning light streaming through sheer curtains. Cecilia was awake, sitting upright against pillows with better color than the night before. The IV had been removed, and she wore one of the silk robes Damien had ordered delivered overnight. Her hair had been washed, revealing golden undertones that malnutrition had dimmed but not destroyed. She looked fragile still, breakable, but recognizably herself. Her gaze found Felix immediately, and the sound that escaped her was something between sob and prayer. Her hands rose toward him before she caught herself, uncertainty flooding her features. "Baby," she whispered. "My baby, you got so big." Felix stood frozen in the doorway, processing the woman who matched his fragmented memories, but looked nothing like the vibrant figure in photographs. His grip on Damien's hand tightened, and for a terrible moment, Damien feared he'd bolt, overwhelmed by the reality of a mother who'd become more myth than memory. Then Felix stepped forward, each footfall deliberate, closing the distance between them with the caution of someone approaching a wounded bird. He stopped at the bed's edge, his eyes level with Cecilia's despite her elevated position. "You look like the hungry people on TV," he observed with childhood's brutal honesty. Cecilia's laugh was watery, tears streaming down her face as she nodded. "I was very hungry for a long time, but I'm going to get better now. Your daddy's taking care of me." Felix considered this, his gaze moving between his parents as if mapping the geometry of their renewed connection. Did being hungry hurt? "Jamie says his grandpa's hungry hurt because of the war, and that's why he saves all the food even when there's enough." "It hurt sometimes," Cecilia admitted, reaching out slowly to touch Felix's cheek. But thinking about you made it hurt less. I thought about you every single day, wondered what you were learning, what games you liked, if you still loved the songs we used to sing." Felix leaned into her touch, his small body relaxing as recognition bypassed conscious thought. "Mrs. Chen tried to teach me the songs, but she didn't know all the words. And the dragon song, she only knew Chinese dragons, not your made-up ones." "I remember every word," Cecilia said softly. "I can teach them to you again if you'd like. We can add new verses for all the time we missed." Felix climbed onto the bed with sudden decision, curling against Cecilia's side with the unconscious trust of a child finding his anchor. She wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his hair as sobs shook her frame. Damien watched them fit together like separated pieces finally rejoined, the image burning itself into his memory with painful clarity. "Mrs. Chen dabbed at her eyes, her tissues inadequate for the magnitude of her emotion. She caught Damien's gaze, mouthing silent gratitude before slipping from the room to grant them privacy. Damien remained, unable to look away from his fractured family beginning the impossible process of reassembly. "Daddy says you were sick," Felix said, his voice muffled against Cecilia's shoulder. "Are you going to get better and stay this time?" Cecilia's eyes found Damien's over Felix's head, the question in them mirroring their son's. Damien crossed to the bed, sitting on the opposite side so Felix was bracketed between them. "She's staying," he said with absolute conviction. "We're going to make sure she gets completely better, and then we're going to be a family again." Felix seemed to accept this, his breathing evening out as exhaustion from emotional overwhelm took hold. Within minutes, he was asleep, trusting in a way only children could that the adults would maintain the world he'd just reconstructed. Cecilia stroked his hair with reverent fingers, each touch a reclamation of motherhood stolen from her. "Thank you," she whispered to Damien, "for bringing him to me, for not punishing me by keeping him away." Damien shook his head, anger sparking at the assumption. "You're his mother. Nothing that happened changes that. And Cecilia, we will find who did this. I swear on Felix's life, they will answer for every moment they stole from you both." The investigation consumed the next 48 hours like wildfire through dry timber, Damien's external security team peeling back layers of organizational activity with forensic precision. Financial records revealed anomalies that should have triggered alerts years ago. Small transfers to untraceable accounts, expense reports with subtle inconsistencies, patterns that became obvious only when viewed through the lens of systematic deception. Warren's movements during the crucial timeline showed nothing overtly suspicious, but the absence of evidence itself became damning. His communications had been meticulously scrubbed, his digital footprint sanitized with professional thoroughness that suggested premeditation. The consigliere had anticipated investigation, prepared countermeasures that spoke to guilty conscience rather than innocent caution. Damien sat in his office reviewing surveillance footage from 3 years prior, watching Warren's interactions with Cecilia frame by frame. The consigliere's body language around her had always been deferential, professional, but now Damien noticed micro-expressions he'd missed in real time, the tightening around Warren's eyes when Cecilia laughed, the subtle tension in his jaw when she touched Damien's arm, the way he looked away when they displayed affection. The revelation crystallized during footage from a family dinner 2 weeks before Cecilia's disappearance. Warren had brought documents requiring signature, arriving during the meal with apologetic timing that now seemed calculated. Cecilia had insisted he join them, her natural hospitality extending even to business interruptions. The camera captured Warren watching her serve Felix, his expression unguarded for precisely 3 seconds. Naked longing mixed with something darker, possessive and resentful. Damien replayed those 3 seconds repeatedly, watching desire curdle into determination. Warren had wanted Cecilia, not with the distant admiration of an associate, but with the consuming obsession of someone who believed himself more deserving. The realization made Damien's skin crawl, understanding that his most trusted advisor had coveted his wife while smiling across conference tables. Dr. Parrish arrived for his evening check on Cecilia, his medical bag heavier than usual with cardiac monitoring equipment. He set up the portable EKG in the master bedroom, his movements efficient despite obvious fatigue from round-the-clock care. "Her heart rhythm is stabilizing," he reported, adjusting leads on her chest. "The rest and proper nutrition are making measurable differences already." Cecilia submitted to the examination with quiet resignation, her attention fixed on Felix playing in the corner with toy cars Damien had retrieved from storage. The boy had barely left her side since their reunion, sleeping in a cot positioned beside her bed, seeking constant reassurance through physical proximity that she wouldn't vanish again. "The psychological damage will take longer," Parrish said quietly, packing away his equipment. "She's experiencing classic trauma responses, hypervigilance, anxiety, dissociative episodes. I've recommended a psychiatrist who specializes in prolonged stress disorders, someone who understands the particular pressures of your world." Damien nodded, having already researched specialists who could provide care without compromising security. Cecilia needed professional help processing 3 years of survival mode, relearning safety after endless threat. The prospect of medication, therapy sessions, gradual recovery stretched ahead like a marathon with no clear finish line. "There's something else," Parrish added, his voice dropping further. "The malnutrition affected her reproductive system significantly. The likelihood of future pregnancies is severely compromised, possibly eliminated entirely. She should know when she's strong enough to process that information." The news hit Damien like a physical blow, another layer of theft perpetrated by whoever had engineered this nightmare. Cecilia had wanted more children, had spoken wistfully about giving Felix siblings, about their home filled with the chaos of multiple voices. That future had been stolen along with 3 years of her life, casualties in someone's twisted campaign. Felix brought his favorite car to show Cecilia, climbing onto the bed with the practiced ease of someone who'd claimed that space as rightfully his. "This one's the fastest," he explained seriously. "It can beat all the others, even on the bumpy track." Cecilia accepted the toy with appropriate gravitas, examining its features as Felix pointed out modifications he'd imagined. Her smile was genuine, despite the exhaustion visible in every line of her body. Maternal instinct overriding physical depletion. "You'll have to show me all your tricks," she said. "I bet you've invented games I've never even imagined." The domestic scene provided sharp contrast to the investigation's darkness unfolding in Damien's office. He excused himself, leaving Parrish to complete his examination, while he returned to evidence that accumulated like stones building a wall of certainty. Warren's innocence became increasingly implausible with each new discovery. The breakthrough came from phone records cross-referenced with Cecilia's timeline of threatening letters. The number provided for confirming her departure traced to a burner phone purchased with cash, but cellular tower data revealed its location during key dates, consistently pinging towers near Warren's residence. The consigliere had been sloppy in one crucial detail, underestimating the sophistication of modern telecommunications forensics. Damien's hands trembled as he compiled the evidence into a comprehensive file, rage threatening to overwhelm strategic thinking. Warren had sat across from him for 3 years, offering counsel and sympathy about Cecilia's abandonment, all while knowing exactly where she was and what horrors she endured. The betrayal transcended professional misconduct, entering territory of personal violation so profound it demanded biblical retribution. His phone buzzed with a message from his lead investigator. Additional evidence recovered from Warren's personal computer, encrypted files containing surveillance photographs of Cecilia and Felix. The images matched descriptions from the threatening letters: playground visits, school pickups, bedroom windows. Warren had personally documented their son's vulnerability, constructing the evidence used to terrorize Cecilia into exile. Damien stood, straightening his jacket with movements made mechanical by fury, too vast for expression. The time for investigation had ended. Confirmation phase was complete. Now came consequences, and he would ensure they matched the crime's magnitude. Warren had declared war on his family using methods that violated every code the organization claimed to honor. The conference room still held the detained council members, their patience wearing thin after days of confinement. Damien entered to find them in various states of agitation, complaints dying on their lips as they registered his expression. He'd seen his own face in mirrors during moments of lethal intent, knew the look that preceded irreversible action. Warren Finch has been identified as the individual responsible for Cecilia's disappearance, Damien announced without preamble. Evidence is comprehensive and conclusive. You're all released from confinement with apologies for the inconvenience. This matter will be handled through appropriate channels. The phrase appropriate channels hung in the air with weighted implication, understood by everyone present as code for something outside legal systems. The council members filed out quickly, relieved to escape, but carrying knowledge they'd witnessed the opening act of retribution that would become organizational legend. Damien found Warren in his assigned quarters, the consigliere standing at the window overlooking the city. He didn't turn as Damien entered, his shoulders carrying resignation that confirmed guilt more completely than any confession. "You found the files," Warren said quietly. "I wondered how long it would take." "Why?" The question emerged strangled, Damien's control fracturing under the weight of betrayal. You were family, trusted above all others. What possessed you to destroy mine? Warren finally turned, his distinguished features arranged in an expression of bitter justification. Because she made you weak. I watched you transform from your father's ruthless heir into a man who hesitated, who second-guessed, who prioritized bedtime stories over strategic opportunities. The organization needed its leader back, not a domesticated shadow-playing house. The words revealed delusion so complete it bordered on psychosis, a worldview where love equaled weakness and family represented liability. Damien studied the man he'd trusted with his life, seeing him clearly for the first time. A fanatic who'd sacrificed everything human on the altar of power worship. You loved her, Damien said, the realization arriving with sickening clarity. That's what this really was. You wanted her, convinced yourself I didn't deserve her, and when you couldn't have her, you made sure no one could. Warren's expression cracked, revealing the obsession beneath professional veneer. She was wasted on you. I would have cherished her, protected her properly, given her the life she deserved. Instead, she chose the man who'd inevitably destroy her through his enemy's ambitions. The admission hung between them like a detonation, confirming motivations even more twisted than Damien had imagined. Warren had orchestrated Cecilia's exile not just for organizational benefit, but from unrequited obsession, punishing her for choosing the wrong man, while convincing himself he acted from noble strategic concern. The dual motivation made the betrayal somehow worse, personal vendetta disguised as professional necessity. You destroyed her life because she didn't love you back, Damien said, his voice dropping to the dangerous quiet that preceded violence. 3 years of homelessness, starvation, terror, all because you couldn't accept rejection. Warren's jaw tightened, defiance flaring despite his compromised position. I saved the organization from your weakness. Your enemies were circling, waiting for opportunities your domestic attachments provided. I eliminated their leverage before they could exploit it, catastrophically. The rationalization was breathtaking in its self-deception, demonstrating how thoroughly Warren had convinced himself of righteous motivation. Damien wondered how long the obsession had festered, how many years Warren had watched and wanted while maintaining professional masks. The thought of him observing their intimate family moments while harboring such twisted desires made Damien's skin crawl. You photographed my son through his bedroom window, Damien stated, each word precise as a scalpel. You documented his routines with predatory thoroughness, turned his daily life into ammunition for terrorizing his mother. Explain how that protected anything except your own sick fantasy. Warren's composure finally cracked completely, rage transforming his distinguished features into something ugly and resentful. She should have disappeared permanently. I gave her mercy by allowing survival, minimal resources to start elsewhere. Instead, she stayed local, haunting these streets like a ghost, tempting fate by remaining where you might find her. The admission that Warren had provided minimal resources revealed even deeper calculation. He'd orchestrated her homelessness deliberately, ensuring sufficient suffering to punish her rejection, while keeping her alive to experience maximum degradation. The cruelty was surgical, designed to destroy dignity rather than simply eliminate threat. She stayed because she couldn't leave Felix completely, Damien said, understanding Cecilia's choice with painful clarity. Even homeless and starving, she needed proximity to our son. That's what motherhood means, something you'd never comprehend. Warren laughed bitterly, the sound devoid of genuine humor. Motherhood. You elevated her maternal instincts into virtues while they made you predictable, exploitable. Every decision filtered through how it affected your domestic fantasy, weakening responses to real threats. Damien's fist connected with Warren's jaw before conscious decision registered, the impact satisfying on a primitive level that transcended strategy. The consigliere staggered backward, blood flowering from split lip, shock registering that physical violence had entered their confrontation. Damien had always prided himself on control, on choosing calculated responses over emotional reaction, but this betrayal demolished carefully constructed restraint. You don't get to speak about her, Damien said, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. You don't get to rationalize or justify or pretend this was anything but obsessive punishment for a woman who owed you nothing. Warren wiped blood from his mouth, his expression shifting from shock to something almost triumphant. There it is, the weakness I was trying to eliminate. You're so consumed by her that you'll destroy yourself for revenge, prove every criticism of your leadership valid. The psychological manipulation was transparent, a final attempt to reframe the narrative and maintain some illusion of strategic superiority. Damien recognized the tactic, but couldn't fully dismiss its sting. Warren had identified genuine vulnerability and exploited it with surgical precision. The question now was whether seeking justice for Cecilia represented strength or the very weakness Warren had sought to eliminate. "I'm not destroying myself," Damien said quietly, pulling out his phone. "I'm removing a cancer from my organization through proper channels, ensuring everyone understands the cost of betraying family loyalty." He dialed his attorney, the same legal mind who'd navigated countless organizational crises. "I need you to prepare a comprehensive criminal referral," he said, keeping his gaze locked on Warren. "Everything: stalking, terroristic threatening, conspiracy, attempted murder through deprivation, full cooperation with authorities, complete transparency." Warren's eyes widened, genuine fear replacing defiance for the first time. "You're turning me over to police? That's not how we handle internal matters. You'll expose organizational operations, invite investigations that destroy everything your father built." "My father built an empire on loyalty and family honor," Damien countered. "You violated both in the most fundamental way possible. If protecting the organization means allowing your crimes to go unpunished, then the organization doesn't deserve protection." The decision represented a departure from traditional handling of internal betrayal, choosing legal consequences over the extrajudicial violence Warren had expected. Damien recognized the risks. Police involvement meant scrutiny, investigations that might uncover activities better left hidden. But the alternative was allowing Warren's crimes against Cecilia to be handled privately, buried under organizational secrecy like they mattered less than protecting institutional reputation. "She'll have to testify," Warren said, grasping for leverage. "Relive everything in court, face cross-examination designed to destroy her credibility. You'll subject her to additional trauma just to satisfy your revenge fantasy." Damien had considered this, the possibility that pursuing justice might inflict new wounds on someone already devastated by Warren's original campaign. But Cecilia deserved the validation of public acknowledgement, the societal confirmation that crimes against her warranted serious consequence. Burying this privately would implicitly suggest her suffering mattered less than organizational convenience. "That will be her choice," Damien said. "Not mine, not yours, hers. She gets to decide how this proceeds, what justice looks like, whether public testimony serves her healing or hinders it." Warren slumped against the wall, the fight draining from him as reality settled like concrete. His careful planning had accounted for many contingencies, but apparently not for Damien choosing legal exposure over traditional resolution. "The organization will fracture over this," he predicted. "Old guard will see it as weakness, as prioritizing one woman over collective security. Then they can leave," Damien said simply. "I'm rebuilding this organization around different principles, ones that recognize family as strength rather than liability, that honor the people we love instead of treating them as strategic vulnerabilities to be eliminated." He called security to escort Warren to secure holding until police arrival, watching the consigliere shuffled away with none of the dignity he'd maintained throughout decades of service. The sight should have provided satisfaction, but Damien felt only exhaustion and the weight of choices that would reshape everything he'd inherited. Returning to the master bedroom, he found Cecilia awake despite the late hour, her eyes tracking his entrance with the hypervigilance trauma had taught her. Felix slept soundly in his cot, small chest rising and falling with the peaceful rhythm of childhood innocence. "Is it done?" she asked quietly. "Did you find who did this?" Damien sat on the bed's edge, taking her hand with a gentleness that felt almost foreign after the violence of the confrontation. "Warren Finch, my consigliere. He's been arrested. Will face criminal charges for everything he did to you. But Cecilia, there's something you need to understand about his motivations." He explained Warren's obsession carefully, watching her process the revelation that she'd been targeted not just strategically, but personally. Her expression cycled through disbelief, disgust, and a weary resignation that suggested this kind of unwanted attention had been distressingly familiar throughout her life. The weeks following Warren's arrest transformed the penthouse into a battlefield of recovery, each day bringing small victories and devastating setbacks in unpredictable rhythm. Cecilia's physical healing progressed measurably. The cardiac specialists Parrish consulted confirmed her heart function, improving with proper medication and nutrition. The dangerous arrhythmias stabilizing into patterns that suggested she might avoid the premature death that had seemed inevitable on the streets. But psychological recovery followed no such linear trajectory. manifesting instead in cycles that defied prediction or control. Mornings when Cecilia seemed almost herself, laughing at Felix's observations about his expanding world, would collapse into afternoons where she couldn't leave the bedroom without experiencing panic attacks so severe they mimicked cardiac episodes. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the trauma specialist Parrish recommended, visited 3 times weekly, her sessions with Cecilia stretching into hours as they excavated 3 years of survival mechanisms that no longer served but couldn't be easily discarded. Damien attended some sessions at Dr. Tanaka's invitation, listening as Cecilia described hypervigilance that made sleep nearly impossible, the constant sense of being watched that crowds had reinforced during homeless months. Every person on the street became a potential threat, Cecilia explained, her hands twisting the cashmere blanket Damien had bought to replace the donated coat she'd finally allowed him to throw away. Every sudden movement could be someone coming to make good on the promises in those letters. Felix adapted with the resilience of childhood, but not without cost that became evident in subtle behavioral changes. He'd started hoarding food in his room, small caches of crackers and fruit discovered under his bed and behind books on his shelf. When Damien gently questioned this, Felix explained with heartbreaking logic that if Mommy got hungry again, he wanted to be able to help her right away. The boy also developed proximity anxiety, becoming distressed when Cecilia left his sight even briefly. Bathroom trips required careful negotiation, Cecilia leaving the door cracked while Felix waited outside, counting to reassure himself she'd return. Dr. Tanaka explained this was normal for children reunited with absent parents, but watching his son's small face crumple when Cecilia moved to another room never became easier. Warren's case proceeded through legal channels with the inevitability of an avalanche, each new revelation adding weight to charges already substantial. The prosecutor assigned to the case was a woman named Jennifer Hale, whose reputation for pursuing stalking and domestic terror cases with righteous fury made her ideal for this particular prosecution. She visited the penthouse to interview Cecilia, her professional demeanor softening as she listened to testimony that clearly affected her on personal level. Hale brought with her a victim advocate named Sienna Park, whose specialized training in trauma-informed interviewing techniques helped Cecilia navigate the difficult process of recounting her experiences for legal documentation. Park's gentle questioning drew out details Cecilia had suppressed, memories of specific threats, and their psychological impact that would be crucial for establishing the comprehensive nature of Warren's campaign. The sessions left Cecilia drained but also strangely validated, the official acknowledgement of her suffering, providing external confirmation that her fear had been rational rather than paranoid overreaction. The media discovered Warren's arrest within days, despite Damien's efforts to maintain confidentiality, tabloid headlines sensationalizing the case with lurid speculation about mafia family drama and love triangles. Reporters camped outside the building's perimeter, telephoto lenses aimed at windows in hopes of capturing photographs that would feed public appetite for scandal. Damien increased security protocols, instructed his legal team to pursue harassment charges against particularly aggressive journalists, but couldn't entirely shield Cecilia from awareness that her nightmare had become entertainment for strangers. The organization's response to Warren's arrest rippled through the hierarchy like seismic aftershocks. Old Guard members questioning Damien's decision to involve law enforcement in internal matters. Phone calls from allied families flooded his secure line, their leaders expressing concern about precedent being set, about washing organizational laundry in public forums where prosecutors might exploit exposure. Damien fielded each conversation with patience that belied his exhaustion, explaining repeatedly that crimes against family transcended organizational politics. Several senior members requested emergency council meetings, their thinly veiled agenda centering on damage control and traditional resolution methods. Damien refused these requests categorically, recognizing them as attempts to pressure him into handling Warren's betrayal through extrajudicial means that would bury Cecilia's suffering beneath institutional secrecy. The refusals cost him political capital accumulated over years of strategic relationship building, alliances fracturing under pressure of his unorthodox approach. Marcus Delacroix, head of the New Orleans operation and Damien's father's oldest associate, arrived unannounced at the penthouse demanding audience. His weathered face carried decades of organizational history, eyes that had witnessed evolution from Prohibition-era violence to modern corporate legitimacy. "Your father would be ashamed," Delacroix stated without preamble, his Creole accent thickening with emotion. "Exposing family business to satisfy personal vendetta violates every principle we built this empire upon." Damien met the accusation without flinching, his response measured despite anger simmering beneath professional veneer. My father built his empire on protecting what mattered most: family, loyalty, honor above profit. Warren violated all three by terrorizing my wife and son. If you believe covering that up honors my father's memory, you misunderstood everything he stood for. The confrontation ended with Delacroix's departure, his silence more damning than further argument, both men understanding a philosophical divide too fundamental to bridge through negotiation. Cecilia's reaction to media attention manifested in renewed hypervigilance, her progress toward feeling safe deteriorating as she imagined thousands of eyes consuming details of her degradation. She stopped venturing onto the penthouse terrace, convinced that cameras were documenting her every movement for broadcast to audiences who would judge her choices and question her credibility. Dr. Tanaka adjusted their therapy focus to address this new layer of violation, helping Cecilia distinguish between legitimate threat and anxiety-amplifying perceived danger beyond realistic proportions. Felix absorbed the increased tension despite adults' efforts to shield him, his questions becoming more pointed about why strangers wanted to take pictures of their family. Damien struggled to explain media fascination in age-appropriate terms, finally settling on simplified narrative about people being curious about things they didn't understand. The explanation satisfied Felix temporarily, but Damien recognized they were entering territory where childhood innocence couldn't be preserved indefinitely. Their son would eventually understand the full scope of what Warren had done and why his family's suffering had become public spectacle. Your case has unusual elements, Hale explained during one of her visits, spreading photographs and documents across the dining table Damien had finally started using. The defendant's position in an organization traditionally resistant to legal cooperation, his sophisticated methods, the duration of the campaign. But the evidence is overwhelming, and his attorney is already exploring plea arrangements to avoid trial. Cecilia's reaction to the possibility of avoided trial was complex, relief warring with something that looked like disappointment. I thought I'd have to face him, she said quietly. Thought I'd have to stand up in court and prove I wasn't lying about what happened. Hale leaned forward, her expression fierce with protective advocacy. You don't have to prove anything. The evidence proves itself. Surveillance photographs, financial records, phone data, his own encrypted files. Your testimony would be powerful, but it's not necessary to secure conviction. You get to choose whether public testimony serves your healing or re-traumatizes you. The conversation echoed Damien's promise to Warren, returning agency to Cecilia after 3 years of having choices stolen by terroristic threats. She considered for a long moment, her gaze distant as she processed implications of both options. I want him to hear me, she finally decided. Want him to sit in that courtroom and listen while I describe exactly what his obsession cost. Maybe that makes me vindictive, but I've earned the right to vindictiveness. Hale's smile was approving, the expression of someone who'd seen too many victims denied their voices. Vindictiveness gets a bad reputation. Sometimes it's just justice wearing different clothes. We'll prepare you thoroughly. Make sure you're ready for anything the defense attempts. Felix's presence during these adult conversations was carefully managed, Mrs. Chen entertaining him in other rooms when topics veered too dark for childhood exposure. But the boy's intuitive awareness picked up on tensions he couldn't fully understand, manifesting in questions that demonstrated unsettling perceptiveness. Is Mommy going to have to go away again? He asked Damien one evening, his jade eyes too old for his young face. Never, Damien promised, pulling Felix into his lap. What happened before was because someone lied to her, made her think leaving was the only way to keep you safe. But that person can't lie anymore, and Mommy knows the truth now. She's staying right here with us. Felix absorbed this, his small fingers tracing patterns on Damien's watch. The other kids at tutoring have mommies and daddies who live together. Are you and Mommy going to be like that again? The question opened territories Damien had been avoiding. Uncertainty about how to rebuild a relationship that had been violently interrupted during its foundation-laying phase. He and Cecilia existed in strange limbo, technically still married legally, since she'd never been declared dead, and no divorce proceedings had occurred, but strangers to each other after 3 years of separate evolution. That's something Mommy and I need to figure out, Damien said carefully. Right now, we're focused on helping her get completely better. The other stuff we'll work through when the time is right. But the truth was more complicated than his simple explanation suggested. Damien found himself watching Cecilia with the confusion of someone who'd mourned a loss now reversed, uncertain how to navigate resurrection of what he'd thought permanently dead. She still carried herself with the grace that had first captivated him, still possessed the sharp observational skills that made her art insightful and profound. But trauma had carved new depths into her features, added layers of wariness that made her seem simultaneously familiar and foreign. Their conversations remained careful, dancing around intimacy neither felt ready to reclaim. They discussed Felix's development, Cecilia's medical progress, household logistics that needed coordination, but the deeper topics, what they'd each become in 3 years apart, whether the people they'd been when they married still existed, remained unspoken territories too dangerous to navigate prematurely. Warren's trial began on a humid June morning, the courthouse surrounded by security preventing media circus from overwhelming proceedings. Cecilia wore a tailored navy dress Hale had helped select, something professional without appearing expensive, careful calibration of image for jury perception. Damien sat in the gallery's first row, his presence both support and silent warning to anyone who might consider approaching his wife with anything less than respect. Warren entered in prison-issued clothing, his distinguished appearance diminished by incarceration's toll. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, silver hair no longer impeccably groomed, the arrogant confidence that had characterized his professional life stripped away by consequences finally catching him. He glanced toward Cecilia once as bailiffs led him to the defense table, his expression unreadable before he looked away. The trial unfolded over 3 weeks, each day revealing new layers of Warren's calculated campaign. Prosecutors presented surveillance photographs, documented financial transfers, expert testimony about psychological impact of prolonged terroristic threats. Character witnesses described Cecilia before her disappearance, vibrant, confident, devoted mother, contrasting sharply with the traumatized woman Warren's actions had created. Cecilia's testimony occupied an entire day, Hale guiding her through chronological recounting of 3 years' nightmare. She spoke clearly despite visible trembling, describing the photographs that had terrorized her, the impossible choice between her presence and her son's safety, the degradation of homelessness endured to honor threats she'd believed credible. The jury watched with expressions ranging from sympathy to horror, several members visibly emotional as Cecilia detailed finding warmth in discarded coffee cups and sleeping in shelters among strangers. Warren's attorney attempted cross-examination designed to suggest Cecilia had overreacted, that the threats were vague rather than specific, that her choice to become homeless represented mental instability rather than maternal protection. But the tactic backfired spectacularly when Hale redirected, allowing Cecilia to explain with devastating clarity why a mother would choose any suffering to prevent potential harm to her child. The verdict came after 4 hours of deliberation, guilty on all counts, including charges carrying mandatory minimum sentences that would ensure Warren spent decades behind bars. Cecilia's shoulders sagged with relief when the forewoman read the decision, 3 years of tension releasing in a single exhale. Damien reached forward from his seat to squeeze her shoulder, the simple touch conveying support words couldn't capture. Sentencing occurred 2 weeks later, Judge Whitfield delivering a statement that acknowledged the particular cruelty of weaponizing maternal love against its target. "You identified the strongest bond in human experience," she told Warren, "and transformed it into an instrument of torture. Your actions represent betrayal of trust, abuse of power, and psychological terrorism of the most calculated kind. This court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole." Warren's expression remained stoic, as guards led him away, but Cecilia thought she saw something crumble behind his eyes. Final acceptance that his obsession had destroyed not just her life, but his own. The courtroom emptied slowly, spectators filing out while discussing the case in hushed tones. Damien guided Cecilia through side exits to avoid media waiting at main doors, his security team creating barrier between them and cameras. The months following sentencing brought gradual restoration of normalcy, though Cecilia's therapist cautioned that complete recovery would take years rather than seasons. She resumed painting, her studio becoming sanctuary where she processed trauma through art that critics would later describe as hauntingly powerful. Galleries requested exhibitions, but Cecilia declined for now, content to create without audience pressure. Felix's behavioral issues slowly resolved as consistency proved his mother's permanence, the food hoarding decreasing until Mrs. Chen found no hidden caches during her weekly cleaning. The proximity anxiety persisted longer, but modified into healthier attachment patterns. Felix could tolerate Cecilia's absence without panic, as long as clear communication established when she'd return. Damien restructured his organization around principles that honored family as strength rather than liability. purging members who couldn't adapt to evolution beyond old guard brutality. Several key associates left, unwilling to embrace leadership that valued domestic considerations alongside strategic positioning. But younger members, many with families of their own, welcomed the shift enthusiastically. The organization transformed, becoming something Damien's father might not recognize, but would hopefully respect. One evening in early autumn, Damien found Cecilia on the penthouse terrace she'd finally reclaimed, watching the sun set over the city that had been both prison and home. Felix was at a sleepover, his first, carefully negotiated after weeks of preparation, leaving them alone in rare silence. "Can we talk?" Cecilia asked, echoing the question she'd posed months earlier about defining their relationship. Damien joined her at the railing, close enough to feel her warmth without touching. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Cecilia was quiet for a long moment, watching colors bleed across the horizon. "I've been thinking about what Dr. Tanaka said in our last session, about how trauma changes people permanently, how we can't go back to who we were before. I can't be the woman you married, Damien. That person doesn't exist anymore." The admission carried weight of truth Damien had been avoiding acknowledging. "I'm not the man you married either. 3 years of believing you'd abandoned us, of raising Felix alone, of building an empire while mourning what I'd lost. It changed me fundamentally. So where does that leave us?" Cecilia's voice was steady, the strength she'd cultivated through survival evident in her directness. "Do we try to build something new from who we are now? Or do we acknowledge that too much has changed to recover what we had?" Damien considered carefully, recognizing the conversation's importance demanded honesty over comfort. "I don't know if I can love you the way I did before, with that uncomplicated certainty that made everything seem simple. But I know I love who you've become, the survivor who endured hell to protect our son, the artist who transforms pain into beauty, the woman who chose to face her tormentor in court instead of accepting a plea deal." Cecilia turned to face him fully, her jade eyes reflecting the sunset's fire. "I can't promise I'll ever fully trust again, that I won't wake up expecting threats, or see danger in shadows that are just shadows. But I want to try. For Felix, yes, but also for us, for the chance to discover what we might become together." Damien extended his hand, the gesture both invitation and question. Cecilia studied it for a heartbeat before placing her palm against his, their fingers intertwining with the tentative exploration of new connection, rather than comfortable familiarity. "We'll take it slow," he promised. "No expectations, no pressure. Just 3 people learning to be a family in whatever form that takes." They stood together as darkness claimed the sky, the city lights below illuminating possibilities neither had dared imagine during their darkest moments. Felix would return tomorrow, full of stories about his adventure, and they would listen together, 2 damaged people committed to providing their son the stability trauma had stolen. The future remained uncertain, scarred by the past, but no longer defined by it. Cecilia leaned her head against Damien's shoulder, a gesture of trust that felt monumental given everything she'd endured. "Thank you," she whispered, "for finding me, for believing me, for fighting for justice when it would have been easier to handle it quietly. You gave me back my voice when I'd forgotten I had one." Damien pressed a kiss to her temple, gentle and chaste, the promise of potential, rather than claim of possession. "You never lost your voice. Warren tried to silence you, but you survived to tell your story. That's not something I gave you. That's something you earned through every impossible day you endured." The penthouse door opened to admit Mrs. Chen, returning from her day off with grocery bags for tomorrow's breakfast. She paused, seeing them on the terrace together, a smile crossing her weathered features, before she discreetly retreated to give them privacy. The small moment of domestic normalcy felt precious, a reminder that life continued beyond trauma, that healing happened in incremental moments rather than dramatic revelations. Months became seasons, autumn bleeding into winter, and then spring's renewal, each day adding threads to the tapestry of their reconstructed family. Cecilia's strength returned gradually, her laughter becoming more frequent, as distance from trauma allowed joy to reclaim space in her emotional landscape. She and Damien navigated their relationship with careful intentionality, dating like strangers, learning each other's languages, discovering new connection, unburdened by assumptions about who they should be together. Felix thrived in the stability his parents had fought to provide, his childhood innocence gradually restored through consistency and unconditional love. He no longer asked if his mother would leave, accepting her presence as permanent reality rather than temporary grace. His art teacher noticed improvement in his drawings, the dark colors and chaotic compositions that had characterized his work during Cecilia's absence, giving way to brighter palettes and more hopeful imagery. On the anniversary of the night Damien found Cecilia in the rain, they returned to that restaurant with Felix between them. The awning where she'd knelt looked different now, transformed by context from place of desperation to site of their family's resurrection. "This is where everything changed," Damien told Felix, who'd asked about the significance of the location. "This is where Mommy came back to us." Felix studied the spot with the serious consideration he brought to important matters. "It looks like a good place," he finally decided. "I'm glad she picked here to come back." Cecilia's eyes filled with tears she no longer fought to hide, no longer ashamed of emotion that had kept her human through inhuman circumstances. "Me too, baby. Me too." They went inside for dinner, a family still healing but no longer broken, still scarred, but no longer defined by their wounds. The restaurant staff recognized them, their discretion appreciated as they were seated at a quiet table away from curious eyes. Felix chattered about his upcoming art show at school, excited to display work his mother had helped him create. Cecilia and Damien listened, their hands finding each other across the table, connection re-established through deliberate choice rather than convenient default. Thank you all for following this story of survival, justice, and the resilience of love. If you've been moved by Cecilia and Damien's journey, write in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything as we continue bringing these stories to life. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your engagement helps us reach others who need to hear stories about healing and hope.